violet eyes, massive diamonds, and scandalous marriages. The world called Elizabeth Taylor a capricious man-eater and a fading star. But let me tell you, her sweet life was just a desperate attempt to drown out unbearable agony. Studio bosses hooked her on amphetamines at 9. By 12, they had her filming with a broken spine. She endured 70 hospitalizations, 4 near-death experiences, and a slashed throat. Her legendary husbands weren't romance. They were walking painkillers for a woman whose body had become a torture chamber. Today, we'll strip away the Hollywood gloss and uncover the terrifying truth of how a broken, ridiculed actress ended up being the only one brave enough to challenge death. Journalists wrote about her insatiable appetite for sex and luxury. They got it all wrong. Elizabeth Taylor wasn't chasing pleasure. Her life was a frantic, panicked escape from 2 things: physical pain and the deafening silence of loneliness. She didn't swap men like gloves. She searched for someone to hold her hand while she screamed in agony. She had everything people dream of and everything people fear to death. Look at her list of diagnoses, and you wouldn't believe she lived to old age. Scoliosis, spinal fractures, severe pneumonia, a brain tumor, skin cancer, 2 artificial hips, and an addiction that could kill a horse. You clicked on this story because Elizabeth Taylor's name is linked with glamour, scandals, and a sweet life. But today, we'll wipe away that gloss. We won't rehash the gossip of the 50s. Instead, we'll answer 3 uncomfortable questions Hollywood tried to silence for half a century. First, how did the studio system turn a healthy child into a patient with chronic pain? Second, why were her legendary romances not a star's whim but a form of necessary anesthesia? And third, how did a woman considered a frivolous doll end up being the only one with the steel nerves to face death when the AIDS epidemic began? I've read hundreds of pages of biographical data and medical reports to show you not the star, but a living person trapped in a body that constantly betrayed her. What you'll learn will make you respect her scars, not envy her diamonds. Because Elizabeth Taylor's story isn't a melodrama, it's a chronicle of survival in conditions incompatible with mental health. Act 1. Anatomy of a Catastrophe. Here's what no one tells you when you gaze at old photos of Elizabeth Taylor. You're looking at a woman who, at that very moment, likely endures excruciating physical pain. We've been conditioned to see her body as the standard. The most beautiful woman in the world, the headlines proclaimed. Men desired her. Women wanted to be her. But if you spent even a day in her shoes, you'd return that ticket in a heartbeat. Behind the glamorous photo shoots, her life was less a fairy tale and more a brutal medical drama, where the leading role was a patient whose body systematically betrayed her. Let's get the numbers out of the way, because they sound more like the casualty stats of an infantry battalion than an actress's biography. Elizabeth endured over 70 hospitalizations in her lifetime. 70. That's almost 1 hospital bed for every year of her life. She underwent 20 major surgeries, not cosmetic nips and tucks, but serious, invasive operations that left people relearning how to walk. If you think her drama and diva antics were just star syndrome, you need to grasp one thing. Taylor lived in a constant war with her biology. It all started long before she grew up. Nature gifted her with rare beauty, but it came with a ticking time bomb: congenital scoliosis. Her spine was crooked from the start. Now add to that the harshness of Hollywood in the 40s. At 12, on the set of National Velvet, young Liz fell off a horse. The horse was named King Charles, and the script called for her to write it like a pro. She fell, and a sharp pain shot through her back. Know what the producers did? They didn't call an ambulance. They didn't halt filming. They told her, "Get up, Liz, we're losing light." And she got up. She finished the scene. Only years later would it be revealed that she had broken her back, discs shifted, chronic inflammation set in. The injury at 12 turned her back into a lifelong torture device. Later, she would need surgeries to fuse vertebrae, implant steel rods, but the pain would never fully leave. She learned to walk, smile, and flirt while her nerves screamed distress signals to her brain. But the most terrifying moment, the one that split her life into before and after, happened in '61. This story was supposed to be the end of her biography. Elizabeth was filming Cleopatra in London. The weather was dreadful, damp, typically British. Her already weak immune system collapsed. What started as a cold rapidly morphed into severe Asian pneumonia. Her lungs filled with fluid. She was literally drowning inside her own body. The situation escalated quickly. In her hotel room, she began to suffocate. Her face turned blue. She gasped for air, but no oxygen came. She was rushed to a clinic. Doctors stated, no breath, no pulse, clinical death. Back then, medicine wasn't as gentle as it is now. To bring the Queen of Hollywood back from the brink, the surgeon had to act brutally fast. He performed a tracheotomy right there in the room, slashed her throat to insert a tube and pump air into her lungs. 4 times she was declared dead that night. 4 times. Newspapers worldwide had already laid out morning editions with obituaries. Fox Studios was in a panic, calculating the losses from the death of their top star. But she survived. She came back to show the world something that completely defied the beauty standards of the time. Actresses usually hide their scars. A scar is a flaw, a reminder of mortality. But when Elizabeth appeared at the Oscars soon after her recovery, she wore a dress with a plunging neckline, and there, right in the center of her neck, above the collarbones, was the raw, reddish scar from the tracheotomy. Makeup artists begged to cover it. She refused. This was her statement. That scar spoke louder than any interview. I survived, I beat death, and I don't care what you think of my perfect skin. This episode is just the tip of the iceberg. Her list of ailments reads like a medical encyclopedia. At various times, she faced dysentery, phlebitis, stomach ulcers, adult measles, bursitis, acute viral infections. She had both hips replaced because her bones were disintegrating. She had a brain tumor, benign, but the size of a golf ball, which required a complex 7-hour surgery to remove. She battled pneumonia 3 times, each of which could have been her last. Once, she nearly lost an eye on set when a foreign object damaged her cornea. Another time, she choked on a chicken bone so severely that surgery was needed. It seemed the universe itself was trying to rid itself of her, but Taylor had a phenomenal, almost primal will to live. Why is this important to understand? Because it completely changes the lens through which we view her behavior. When critics called her lazy for being late to shoots, they didn't know it took her 2 hours in the morning just to get her body upright and wait for the painkillers to kick in. When she faced accusations of indulgence, the world saw excess but missed the reason. And the reason was simple and terrifying. She needed to numb the pain. Imagine living in a body that constantly aches, stabs, cuts, and breaks. You're the sex symbol of an era. You have to shine, but inside you're on fire. The traditional medicine of the time offered generous handfuls of opiates and barbiturates, and she took them, not for a high, just to function. Her luxurious life was a gilded cage, inside which sat a deeply sick person. Her addiction didn't start with nightclub parties. It started with prescriptions from doctors, studio doctors whose job was to get the actress on set at any cost. But physical pain is only half the equation. The body broke because it was exploited. And to understand how this destructive mechanism formed, we need to go back to the very beginning. To where a little girl was taught that she wasn't a person, but corporate property. Act 2. The MGM Laboratory. If physical pain was the constant background noise in Elizabeth's life, then psychological trauma formed the foundation of her fragile skyscraper. To understand why adult Taylor popped pills like candy and swapped husbands like outfits, we need to peek into the place where she was assembled. Welcome to the golden cage of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the 40s. Many mistakenly think a child star's career is a winning lottery ticket. Parents dream of seeing their kids on screen, believing fame brings happiness. For Elizabeth, it wasn't a childhood, but a meticulously planned industrial exploitation. She didn't become a star. She was grown in a test tube of the studio system, like a rare orchid hybrid meant solely for sale. When we talk about the MGM system, don't picture kindly producers with candy. Imagine a harsh, totalitarian structure run by Louis Mayer, a man who could sign $1 million check with one hand and destroy a psyche with the other. To Mayer and his team, 9-year-old Elizabeth wasn't a child. She was an asset, an investment. And like any investment, she required management, optimization, and most terrifyingly, depreciation. The tragedy began the moment she stepped into the studio. They stole the most crucial things for developing a healthy psyche: the right to play, the right to make mistakes, and the right to privacy. Her day was scheduled to the minute, with no room for just being a kid. Up before dawn, makeup, hair, filming, a brief break for lessons in a studio school that felt more like a juvenile detention center, more filming, interviews, photo shoots. If she got tired, they didn't let her rest. They gave her vitamins. Here we reach the darkest secret of Hollywood's golden age, explaining Taylor's later addictions better than any psychoanalysis. Back then, studio doctors didn't work for the health of their patients, but for production efficiency. If a child actor nodded off halfway through a 14-hour workday, they received pills with amphetamines. This was called perking up. The child would instantly switch on, eyes bright, smile wide. But when filming wrapped late at night, the chemically charged brain couldn't shut down. Then a kind nurse would offer calmatives, barbiturates to knock out the little star until morning. Elizabeth Taylor, like Judy Garland, found herself on this chemical seesaw before she even started menstruating. Her body learned to believe any state, fatigue, sadness, insomnia, was regulated by a pill. She didn't learn to handle emotions or regulate her biorhythms. Pharmacology did it for her. When, 30 years later, the world condemned her for addiction to painkillers and sleeping pills, the world was hypocritical. The mechanism of that addiction was set by the same people who won Oscars for films she starred in. But controlling the body's chemistry was just part of the program. The studio aimed to control Elizabeth's self-perception, too. They treated her like a show horse. Her appearance was scrutinized daily. The famous eyelash story is a prime example. On her first day of filming, the director shouted in fury, "Get that girl off the set and wash off that vulgar makeup." He thought the child's eyes were caked in mascara. When it turned out to be a genetic mutation, dystichiasis, a double row of eyelashes, anger turned to greed. The mutation became a marketing advantage. Her defect transformed into a brand. But it taught little Liz a terrible lesson. Her value lay solely in her physical shell, not in what she thought, not in whether she was kind or mean, but in how the shadows fell from her lashes. Her mother, Sarah Taylor, was no protector but a warden for the system. She willingly sacrificed her daughter's childhood on the altar of her own ambitions. Elizabeth later recalled never having a moment to just go to her mom and cry. Tears were a work tool. Save it for the take, she heard. Her emotions were monetized. If you cry in life, you're wasting a valuable resource. Cry only on cue. This led to total dissociation. Elizabeth stopped knowing where the role ended, and she began. Her whole life became a performance. She learned to be charming, coquettish, mature beyond her years, because that's what earned praise. That's what earned love. One episode starkly illustrates this horror. When Mayer, in a fit of rage, insulted her mother with foul language, young Elizabeth, still a teenager, jumped up and yelled in his face, "Don't you dare talk to my mother like that! I hate you and your studio!" She ran out of the office and threw up. It was a rebellion, but even this rebellion was within the system. Mayer didn't fire her. He respected her fire. He saw in it a new facet of her acting range. Even her genuine hatred was absorbed and digested by the studio. By the time Elizabeth turned 18, she was already a deeply traumatized showbiz veteran. She had millions of fans, but not a single real-life skill. She couldn't tie her shoelaces, didn't know how to write a check, and had no idea how to build relationships outside a script. The studio created the perfect monster, a woman with the looks of a goddess, the needs of a child, and the dependencies of a chronic patient. And when this product was released into the world, disaster was inevitable. She desperately needed someone to replace the studio, someone to tell her what to do and protect her. It was this hunger, this void inside, not depravity, that drove her into the arms of men. She wasn't seeking sex. She was seeking a new studio, a new director to give her life meaning. And this search was agonizing. Act 3, Booze and Scandals as Anesthesia. If earlier I laid out the physiology of her pain and the mechanics of her trauma, the saga with Richard Burton shows how she tried to live with it. Here lies the grandest deception of 20th century pop culture. The world remembers Liz and Dick as the epitome of romantic passion. Glossy magazines sold us a pretty picture. The yacht Charisma docked in Portofino, the 33-carat Krupp diamond, furs, private jets, and a love that could burn cities. It was the wedding of the century, an endless honeymoon of the planet's two most beautiful people. But strip away the Hollywood veneer, and you see not a melodrama, but a raw psychological drama about two deeply unhappy people using each other as potent medicine. Their relationship wasn't a romance in the usual sense. It was a meeting of two disaster survivors. A union of two high-functioning souls who found in each other the only heart capable of understanding the scale of their internal wreckage. To grasp the dynamics of this bond, you need to see Richard Burton not as a great actor, but as a man. The son of a Welsh miner, an intellectual, a cynic who hated Hollywood and despised himself for selling his theatrical talent for movie money. He was full of rage, self-loathing, and contempt for the world. And he drank. He drank like someone trying to erase their identity. Then he meets Elizabeth on the set of Cleopatra in Rome, 1962. She's 29, he's 36. Around them, the most expensive sets in film history. The Vatican officially condemns their affair, calling it erotic vagrancy. Paparazzi besiege their hotels around the clock. The pressure was such that any normal person would break within a week. But they didn't break, because they found in each other the perfect mirror of their own pain. For Taylor, Burton became a substitute for the studio system that broke her, yet she couldn't live without. He was commanding, loud, educated. He told her what to do, what to read, how to dress. He yelled at her, and paradoxically, this gave her a sense of safety. After a childhood controlled by faceless producers for profit, control from a man madly in love with her seemed the highest form of love. She needed a director for her life, and Burton gladly took the megaphone. And what did he find in her? He saw in the temperamental star what others didn't, a wild, untamed life force and a bottomless void like his own. Their legendary fights, eagerly chronicled by tabloids, weren't signs of bad character. They were a way to feel alive. Imagine, you're both constantly under the influence of a cocktail of painkillers for her and liters of vodka for him. Your senses dulled, emotional range narrowed by chemistry. To break through this woolly wall of anesthesia, you need to scream. You need to smash dishes. You need to hurl heavy objects. Their fights were a form of defibrillation. They got the blood pumping to ensure their hearts still beat. Silence was unbearable for them, because in silence came the ghosts, her physical pain and his existential dread. So they filled the air with noise, scandals, and passion. Alcohol in their marriage wasn't a companion of fun, but a third wheel holding the structure together. Burton's morning routine often started not with coffee, but vodka. Elizabeth, whose body demanded constant pain relief due to back issues, easily fell into this rhythm. They created a sealed world, a bubble with its own laws of physics. In this world, it was normal to breakfast with champagne and dine with a scandal, followed by reconciliation with a $1 million jewelry purchase. Diamonds, by the way, were also part of this pathological therapy. Taylor wasn't just greedy for shiny stones. Each gift from Burton, be it the famous Peregrina pearl or the Taylor-Burton diamond, was a kind of band-aid on a soul wound. It was Burton's way of saying, "Sorry, I'm as broken as you." And for her, possessing these treasures was a way to ground herself, to feel her significance materially, tangibly, when her own body felt alien and fragile. But why was this love of the century doomed? Because you can't build a house on a foundation of shared trauma. Two drowning people can hold on to each other for a while to avoid sinking alone, but they can't swim to shore. Their divorce, then remarriage, and another divorce wasn't because love faded. The love never left until their dying days. Divorce was an act of self-preservation. By the mid-70s, Elizabeth began to realize, if she stayed with him, she'd die, physically. Her body, battered by surgeries and alcohol, couldn't keep up with the pace Burton set. His self-destruction was more rapid and aggressive. She didn't leave for another man. She left to survive. The story of Liz and Dick is a lesson in how trauma attracts trauma. It was folie à deux, madness for two, beautiful, tragic, and utterly destructive. They showed the world not a fairy tale of a prince and princess, but an honest, bloody chronicle of two people trying to drown out their inner screams with each other. And when Burton died, Elizabeth was left alone on the ruins of this great empire of feelings. But it was this experience, going through hell together and emerging alone, that prepared her for the next stage. She understood that love isn't just possession and passion. Sometimes love is the ability to let go, so you don't drag each other down. Yet before reaching this wisdom, she had to endure another blow, one not dealt by alcohol or scandals, but by sudden, deafening silence. A blow that happened long before Burton and shaped her fear of loss forever. Act 4. Death that sparked a hunger for possession. If the saga with Burton was a 2-decade storm, the chapter with Mike Todd was a lightning strike that plunged the world into darkness. To grasp why Elizabeth Taylor feared solitude and silence, why she devoured life in greedy gulps, we must dissect the event that split her psyche in two. In the public eye, Mike Todd is just husband number 3, a footnote between the dull Michael Wilding and the scandalous Eddie Fisher. But the truth is, Mike Todd was the architect of Elizabeth Taylor's adult persona. His death was patient zero in the epidemic of her fears. By the time she met Todd in '56, Elizabeth was 24, a woman already weary of life, divorced, remarried, with 2 kids and a career that wasn't hers. A beautiful doll shuffled from place to place. Then Todd appeared. Mike Todd wasn't just a producer. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in human form. 23 years her senior, loud, vulgar, a genius showman who pioneered 70mm film and made Around the World in 80 days. He crashed into her life not with flowers, but with a battering ram. He didn't ask her opinion. He told her they were together now. To someone else, this might seem abusive. But for Taylor, raised under the strict studio system, Todd's dominance was a drug. For the first time, the studio wasn't a faceless board, but one man who worshipped her. He became her father, lover, manager, and protector all in one. He called her baby and made all her decisions. In his shadow, she felt safe for the first time. She could relax because Mike held the sky on his shoulders. Those 13 months were the only time in her life she was utterly, unconditionally happy without a hint of pain. She was pregnant, loved, and protected. Then came March 22nd, '58. The day that proved to Elizabeth that happiness isn't a gift, but a trap. Mike was supposed to fly to New York on his private plane, which he, in a fit of love and vanity, named the Lucky Liz. Elizabeth begged to go with him. She was already packing. But fate, with its dark sense of humor, intervened in the form of her old enemy, illness. Taylor came down with a fever. Bronchitis hit. Mike, concerned for her health, forbade her from flying. He said, "Stay home, get well. I'll be back in a couple of days." She stayed. The plane took off. Hours later, the Lucky Liz flew into an icy storm over New Mexico. The plane crashed with such force and exploded so violently that bodies could only be identified by dental records. From Mike Todd, the man who was her universe, only charred fragments and a wedding ring miraculously survived the flames. When Elizabeth got the news, her scream was so terrifying the neighbors thought someone was being murdered. In a way, they were. It was the death of the naive part of Elizabeth that believed in tomorrow. Her reaction to Todd's death wasn't just widow's grief. It was a total mental collapse. She wanted to end it all. She screamed she should have been on that plane. They sedated her so heavily she could barely speak. But even through the chemical haze, raw terror broke through. And here Hollywood showed its true, ugly face. Mike Todd's funeral in Chicago turned into a grotesque circus. Thousands of fans broke through the barriers. They didn't come to mourn. They came to see a movie star cry. The crowd literally attacked Elizabeth. People grabbed at her clothes, tried to tear off her mourning veil, shouted her name while munching popcorn. She, crazed with grief and tranquilizers, fell to her knees in the cemetery mud, while the crowd pressed on, cameras clicking. This moment changed her DNA forever. She realized two things. First, the crowd is a beast that will devour you alive, even as you stand by your husband's grave. Second, and most important, life is finite, cruel, and can end at any moment. Mike Todd's death birthed Taylor's infamous hedonism. Critics called her loose for starting an affair with her late husband's best friend, Eddie Fisher, just months later. The world condemned her, branding her a black widow and homewrecker. Fisher was married to America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds. But reality beats expectations. This wasn't debauchery. It was a year-long panic attack. Elizabeth clung to Eddie Fisher not out of love. She clung to him because he smelled like Mike. He was the only living thread connecting her to a lost world. She feared sleeping alone. She feared silence because in silence she heard the sound of a plane exploding. She needed living warmth beside her, immediately, at any cost. This trauma shaped her here and now philosophy. Why did she buy diamonds? Because they are eternal. They don't burn in planes. Why did she eat what she wanted and drink as much as she liked? Because tomorrow might never come. Her legendary excess was a fight against death. She tried to fill herself with experiences, things, food, men, to drown out the gaping hole inside. She never postponed life again. If she fell in love, she married. Instantly. No long engagements. If she saw a dress, she bought it. Mike Todd taught her to be a queen, but his death taught her to be a fatalist. She survived the catastrophe, but part of her remained forever in the wreckage of the Lucky Liz. The fear of loss became her eternal companion, and it was this fear that drove her to demand too much from life, just to make sure she was still here. Act 5. The Washington Trap and the Body's Rebellion. This is the chapter biographers often skip, averting their eyes in embarrassment. Here, the image of Fat Liz, mocked by comedians on Saturday Night Live, was born. But if we want to grasp the true depth of her fall and eventual resurrection, we must scrutinize this shameful period. Because here lies the answer to the question, what happens to a woman used to being the sun when she's turned into a table lamp? In 1976, Elizabeth made a mistake common to many women exhausted by chaos. After 2 divorces, worn out by emotional roller coasters, she decided she wanted normalcy. She craved stability, respectability, and quiet. And she found it in John Warner, a handsome, stately Republican, a former Secretary of the Navy aiming for a seat in the United States Senate. It seemed like the perfect script. Hollywood's queen becomes Virginia's first lady. But reality exceeded expectations in the cruelest way. Washington was not a quiet haven, but an exclusion zone with rules incompatible with Elizabeth Taylor's nature. To understand the tragedy of this marriage, we must remember who Elizabeth was. She was a creature made for expression. She lived through emotions, dressed provocatively, spoke loudly, laughed so hard the walls shook. But the role of senator's wife in conservative late 70s, Washington demanded the opposite: invisibility, submission, and beige suits. During Warner's campaign, he shamelessly used her fame. Elizabeth traveled to Virginia's backwater towns, shook hands with farmers, smiled at rallies. People didn't come to hear the dull politician Warner. They came to see the living Cleopatra. She literally carried him into the Senate on her shoulders. But once the elections were won, the scenery changed. The more has done his duty, the more can go. Suddenly, Elizabeth found herself trapped in an apartment in the Watergate complex. The newly minted Senator Warner vanished into work until late at night. Politics demands time. And Elizabeth? She was told, "Don't make a scene." She faced restrictions on her beloved low-cut dresses. They were unprotocol. She received advice against voicing her opinions on political matters. A senator's wife should only nod. For a woman used to commanding film sets, she became a pretty brooch on her husband's lapel. And here began the real hell. The worst enemy for an addict is not stress or grief. It's boredom, isolation. Elizabeth found herself in a gilded cage with nothing to do. She knew no one in Washington. The local politicians' wives, prim, buttoned-up ladies, despised her, considering her a vulgar actress. She was an alien element. How did her body react to this sensory deprivation? It began to rebel. The myth says Elizabeth Taylor got fat because she was a gluttonous slob. Reality tells us her obesity during that period was a form of psychological defense and the only available way to fill the inner void. Food became a substitute for everything: sex, fame, work, interaction. She ate not because she was hungry. She ate to feel anything other than the deafening loneliness: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, chocolate cakes. These were her only friends in the empty apartment. Her weight skyrocketed. From a chiseled statuette, she turned into a hefty matron. She stopped fitting into her famous dresses. But food was only half the problem. In Washington, her old demons, spirits and pills, returned with a vengeance. Picture this. One of the world's most famous women sits alone within four walls. In pajamas she hasn't changed in 2 weeks, watching TV and methodically mixing Jack Daniels with Percodan, a potent painkiller. She drank to kill time. She drank to drown out the resentment towards a husband who ignored her. She drank to numb the back pain, which became unbearable due to the extra weight. It was at this moment the press delivered its cruelest blow. Tabloids ran headlines, "Fat Liz." Paparazzi hunted her, trying to capture the worst angle, showing a double chin and a bloated waist. The great John Belushi on Saturday Night Live donned a dress, stuffed it with pillows, and choked on a chicken leg, impersonating Taylor. All of America laughed. For a woman whose self-esteem was built on her ethereal beauty since childhood, it was akin to a public lynching. She saw those newspapers, she saw those shows, and it drove her to drink and eat even more, locking her in a vicious cycle of self-destruction. It was a death spiral. The climax of this nightmare came in the most grotesque, almost humiliating way, which, however, became a turning point. One evening, Elizabeth choked on a chicken bone. It sounds like a joke, but the situation was critical. The bone lodged so deep in her esophagus that doctors had to perform emergency surgery to remove it. But that wasn't the worst. Doctors, examining her, were horrified by her overall condition. Her liver was at its limit. Her heart faltered under the weight and drugs. It was clear. If she continued this way, she wouldn't live to see 50. Elizabeth awoke from anesthesia and realized she had hit rock bottom. She was a fat, sick, unwanted wife of an indifferent politician, and the whole world laughed at her. The illusion of normal life crumbled to dust. And then she did something unheard of for a star of her magnitude. She didn't hide the problem behind a pretty press release about nervous exhaustion. She admitted defeat. Her family organized an intervention. Elizabeth, always proud and defiant, didn't resist this time. She voluntarily checked into the Betty Ford Center, a clinic for treating alcoholics and addicts. Today, celebrity rehab is routine, part of a PR strategy. But back then, in the early 80s, admitting you were an addict meant ruining your reputation. Stars of the golden age didn't go to rehab. They died in their mansions behind closed curtains, saving face. Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, none of them publicly asked for help. Elizabeth Taylor became the first superstar to openly say, "I am an addict and I need help." Her stay at the clinic became a purgatory. There were no servants. There were no diamonds. She was made to clean toilets, make beds, and sit in a circle with ordinary people, housewives, mechanics, clerks, sharing her pain. All masks were stripped away. There in group therapy, she was just Elizabeth for the first time in 40 years, not Elizabeth Taylor. It was an agonizing process of deconstructing her identity. She had to relearn how to live without chemical crutches. She had to accept her changed body. She had to accept the fact that her marriage to Warner was a sham. But this fall into the mud, this Washington trap, paradoxically saved her. By enduring the humiliation of obesity and the hell of detox, she killed the spoiled prima donna within her. A different woman emerged from the Betty Ford Clinic. Yes, she lost her former angelic beauty, but she gained something more important: honesty. Ironclad, ruthless honesty with herself and the world. She stopped fearing judgment. "What can you do to me?" Her new stance seemed to say. "You've already called me fat, drunk, and old. You've got no bullets left." This period, which everyone thought was the end of her career, actually became the foundation for her greatest role. Because only someone who had been an outcast, laughed at by the crowd, could understand and love other outcasts. It was this new, life-battered Elizabeth who would, a few years later, reach out to Michael Jackson and those dying of AIDS. She descended into hell to return with its keys. But before finding her higher mission, she had to find a kindred spirit in the most unexpected place, in a fairy tale estate where time stood still forever. Act 6. Friendship of Monsters. Elizabeth and Michael Jackson. In the mid-80s, just when Elizabeth seemed to have risen from the ashes of rehab clinics, the world witnessed a spectacle tabloids dubbed the Freak Show. Magazine covers flaunted photos of the oddest pair in showbiz history. On one side, Elizabeth Taylor, an aging diva with teased hair, draped in diamonds. On the other, Michael Jackson, a fragile, androgynous young man in a military jacket with epaulettes, growing paler and more eccentric by the day. The press spewed venom. Comedians built careers on jokes about their relationship. Newspapers questioned, what are they doing together? Swapping makeup tips? Comparing plastic surgeries? Is this a PR stunt? Or shared madness? The public, steeped in cynicism, couldn't believe anything genuine could exist between a 50-year-old actress and a 25-year-old pop idol. Their friendship was labeled grotesque, a union of two reality-detached freaks living in a dreamland. But, as always in Taylor's life, reality was far more complex and tragic than the boldest headlines. Their bond wasn't a romance, and it certainly wasn't for publicity. It was a brotherhood of two veterans from the same invisible war. Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson were perhaps the only two people on Earth whose emotional scars matched perfectly, like a key and a lock. To grasp this attraction, you must strip away their star status and see them as war children. Both fell victim to the same crime: childhood stolen for commercial gain. We've talked about how MGM robbed Liz of her childhood, pumping her with amphetamines and forcing her into an adult schedule. Michael Jackson went through a similar grinder, only his overseer wasn't a studio, but his own father, belt in hand, and his stage wasn't Hollywood, but the smoke-filled clubs of America's Chitlin circuit. When they met, ironically, Elizabeth left his concert in 1984 because it was too loud. Michael called her in tears, begging for forgiveness. They saw in each other not a star, but a mirror reflecting their own pain. Elizabeth looked at Michael and saw herself, the child forced to smile when all they wanted was to cry. Michael saw in Elizabeth the only person in the world who wanted nothing from him. This was crucial. By the mid-'80s, Michael Jackson was the most famous person on the planet. Thousands swarmed around him. Producers, lawyers, relatives, hangers-on. They all saw him as a walking ATM. They all wanted something: money, fame, contracts, a piece of his magic. Elizabeth Taylor was the only one richer, more historically famous, and more prestigious than him. She didn't need his money. She had her own. She didn't need his fame. She was tired of hers. In her presence, Michael could relax. He didn't have to be the king of pop. He could just be a scared, lonely guy. That's why the famous Neverland Ranch became not an amusement park, but a bunker for them. To the outside world, Neverland was a symbol of Jackson's infantilism, a place with carousels, a zoo, and a train. For Elizabeth and Michael, it was a therapeutic safe zone, a place where time could be turned back. They went there to play the games they were never allowed to as children. Imagine this surreal scene: the woman who played Cleopatra and the singer who wrote Thriller sitting on the floor in pajamas, eating ice cream with their hands, watching Disney cartoons, and feeding peanuts to an elephant. The world called it weird. Elizabeth called it healing. She told journalists defending her friend with the ferocity of a lioness, "He's the least strange person I know." She understood that his eccentricity, his attempts to surround himself with children and toys, wasn't perversion, but a desperate attempt to build a world where he wasn't beaten, humiliated, or forced to work. She had spent her life trying to build such a world with husbands and diamonds. Michael built his with carousels. Different tools, same hole in the soul. In this relationship, Elizabeth took on the role she couldn't fully realize with her own children, due to her career and personal chaos. She became a mother to Michael. Not the kind who demands success, but the kind who protects unconditionally. The most telling moment of this friendship came in '93 when the first allegations of child molestation were made against Jackson. It was a moment when everyone turned away from the pop king. Pepsi severed contracts. Friends stopped answering calls. The press was already building the scaffold. Radio stations pulled his songs off the air. Elizabeth Taylor was on the other side of the world. Upon hearing of the witch hunt, she immediately flew to him. She didn't just support him over the phone. She physically stood between him and the mob. She flew with him to Singapore at the height of the scandal when his nervous system collapsed, and he got hooked on painkillers, another tragic intersection. They both knew the hell of addiction. She fed him when he couldn't eat. She held his hand when he wept. She faced the enraged journalists, shouting in their faces that Michael was innocent. It was an act of incredible courage. Supporting the molester, as the media had already labeled him, she risked the remnants of her reputation, her business empire, her AIDS foundation. Everything could crumble due to association with the toxic Jackson. But Elizabeth didn't care about the risks. She knew what it was like to be falsely accused. She remembered being called a murderer after Todd's death and a whore after her affair with Burton. She knew the value of public opinion, zero. To her, Michael wasn't a superstar, but another wounded bird. The system was trying to finish off. And Liz Taylor never abandoned her wounded birds. Their bond was sealed by an event that became the pinnacle of their shared theater of the absurd. Elizabeth's wedding to a simple construction worker, Larry Fortensky, in '91. The wedding took place, of course, at Neverland. The bride's father had long passed, and Michael Jackson walked Elizabeth down the aisle. This picture speaks 1,000 words. Michael, with his unnatural face, and Elizabeth, in a lavish dress worth millions. It looked like a brother's grim fairy tale on acid. But in this gesture was the ultimate truth. Michael was the only man in her life who never betrayed or left her, unlike her husbands. He was her spiritual partner. Elizabeth often said, "Michael and I have no age. We are two old souls who never grew up." This friendship gave Elizabeth something she desperately lacked after her breakup with Burton and humiliation in Washington: a sense of her own strength and wisdom. Protecting Michael, she felt strong. Caring for him, she felt needed. In this strange alliance, she drew energy for her future battles. When people laughed at their photos, sitting in oxygen chambers or walking with the chimpanzee Bubbles, they missed the point. They saw the quirks of wealthy idlers. In reality, they watched two survivors of the showbiz plane crash, building a raft from the wreckage to avoid drowning in the ocean of loneliness. This friendship would last until the very end. When Michael died in 2009, Elizabeth's heart was finally shattered. She would outlive him by only 2 years. After his death, she would say a phrase that sums it all up. "I don't think anyone knew how much we loved each other. It was the purest and most selfless love of my life." But before she followed her friend into eternity, Elizabeth had one last brilliant trick up her sleeve. A trick that would turn her name into gold and give her the resources to change the world. She was about to prove to Hollywood that even if you're written off as an actress, you can still buy the studio whole. Act 7. How to sell your scent to buy freedom. By the late 80s, Elizabeth Taylor faced a problem that had killed more Hollywood careers than drugs and booze combined. It was called unprofitability. The situation was a paradox. Her name was known by anyone with a TV. Her face was a brand as recognizable as Coca-Cola or Mickey Mouse. But as an actress, she was box office poison. Producers feared hiring her. She cost too much, demanded royal treatment, and no one could guarantee she wouldn't end up in the hospital on day 1 of shooting. Insurance companies refused to cover projects with her involved. Elizabeth was trapped by her own legend. She had the fame of an empress, but her income evaporated. And Elizabeth Taylor's life was expensive. Very expensive. Maintaining estates, a staff of servants, medical bills, security, and her insatiable passion for jewelry auctions demanded millions in cash every year. Most stars in her position slowly slid into humiliating gigs, cutting ribbons at supermarkets or auctioning off old dresses. But Elizabeth Taylor wasn't most. She was a woman who survived brain surgery and 7 husbands. She looked at the industry and realized If Hollywood didn't want to buy her acting, she'd sell them something else. Something you couldn't see on screen but could own. She'd sell them her essence, her scent. Thus, a business empire was born, not just saving her from bankruptcy, but making her richer than in her Cleopatra glory days. It was a fragrance revolution, starting with passion and peaking with the legendary white diamonds. To grasp the genius of this move, remember the market context of '87. Before Taylor, the idea of a celebrity perfume was seen as tacky, a sign of bad taste. Attempts by Sophia Loren and Cher had flopped. Perfume giants like Chanel or Dior believed scents should sell an abstract dream, not a living, breathing person, especially someone as scandalous as Liz. When Taylor pitched her fragrance idea to Elizabeth Arden's execs, silence filled the room. Marketers rolled their eyes. They whispered in the halls, "Who wants to smell like a 55-year-old woman with a weight problem, a history of faded glory, and 8 divorces?" They thought they were selling sex and youth. But Elizabeth knew her audience better than any business school grad. She knew American women didn't want to be young models. They wanted to be her. They wanted to touch drama, luxury, the ability to fall and rise again. She wasn't selling floral notes. She was selling the liquid essence of survival and glamour. She approached the perfume creation not as a licensing deal, where a star just signs and cashes a check. She treated it like a role. She sat in labs, sniffing hundreds of samples, driving chemists to hysteria. She insisted on notes of gardenia and tuberose, heavy, sweet, suffocating scents she adored. She said, "It should smell like I've just walked into the room." And when White Diamonds launched in '91, something happened that forever changed the economics of showbiz. The ad campaign for this fragrance became a marketing textbook case. In a black and white clip, Elizabeth, shot with a soft focus to hide her age, removes a diamond earring and murmurs in her husky, sultry voice, "These have always brought me luck." It was a lie turned truth. Diamonds didn't bring her luck, but comfort in grief. Yet millions of women worldwide believed it. Buying a $50 bottle, a housewife in Ohio wasn't purchasing an alcohol solution. She was buying a ticket to a world where men gift you Krupp diamonds, where you fly private to Rome, and where you're a queen despite all scars. Elizabeth invented what we now call parasocial marketing, the empire-building tool for the Kardashians. She broke the fourth wall. She went on a tour of Macy's and Bloomingdale's. These weren't autograph sessions. They were mass riots. Thousands of women stormed the counters. Security had to form barricades. Elizabeth sat on a throne, literally, smiling, holding fans' hands, and spraying them with her perfume like a priest with holy water. She looked into these women's eyes, tired, not wealthy, aging, and they saw her as their champion. She was one of them, only in diamonds. The success was astronomical. White Diamonds became the best-selling celebrity fragrance in history. Sales reached billions. Elizabeth Taylor, written off as an actress, became a perfume mogul. But the real twist wasn't in the numbers. It was in the deal's structure and the money's purpose. Unlike foolish starlets, Elizabeth insisted on a cut of the sales, royalties. This made her independent of any studio, producer, or man. For the first time in her life, at 60, she was completely, utterly, financially free. She no longer needed to act in bad movies for a paycheck. She no longer had to endure the whims of rich husbands. And here lies the true brilliance of her plan. Where did these vanilla glamour dollars go? They went to war. Elizabeth Taylor used her fragrance empire's profits to fund her AIDS foundation, the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. She literally turned human vanity into medicine. Every woman who bought a bottle of white diamonds unwittingly became a sponsor of HIV research, needle exchange programs, and hospice care. It was a genius, almost Robin Hood-like scheme. She took money from the capitalist consumption system, playing by its rules, selling a dream, and redirected those funds to where the state and society feared to look, to help dying outcasts. White Diamonds became her ultimate Oscar, not for acting, but for producing life. She proved that even when the body ages and the voice weakens, the Elizabeth Taylor brand remains an eternal engine. In the 90s and 2000s, when she moved in a wheelchair, it was the checks from Elizabeth Arden that allowed her to maintain that court where broken souls like Michael Jackson found refuge. She bought herself the freedom to be herself, eccentric, loud, generous. The irony, critics said launching a perfume was selling air. Elizabeth proved that air could be harder than diamonds. She left behind a business model followed today by J.Lo, Rihanna, and Beyoncé, but none did it with such existential flair. She didn't just release a perfume, she bottled her spirit of defiance. And every time someone sprays white diamonds, an invisible reminder hangs in the air. You can be broken, betrayed, written off, but as long as you smell like a queen, you are a queen. Now we have all the puzzle pieces: her physical pain, her psychological trauma from the studio, her tragic romances, her fall to rock bottom in Washington, her friendship with Michael, and her financial triumph. Only one thing remains: to tie it all together and put a final point on this incredible story. Act 8, Redemption. This is the finale her entire life led to. A chapter where her fate takes an unexpected, almost biblical twist. If this were a movie, the audience would scoff at the ending, calling it too grandiose, too implausible. But reality, as we know, always outdoes expectations. By the early 80s, Elizabeth Taylor seemed to have reached the end of her road. She was the queen of trash, the face of perfumes, the butt of jokes, and a wealthy widow. A quiet fade-out in a Bel Air mansion, surrounded by servants and portraits of ex-husbands, would have been the logical conclusion. The world had written her off as a cultural relic of the past. But just when no one expected anything from her, another divorce, a plastic surgery. Elizabeth Taylor did what no president, no religious leader, no respectable Hollywood star dared to do. She rose from her velvet throne and went to war. To grasp the scale and heroism of her act, you need to dive into the atmosphere of '85. It was a time of medieval terror in the neon '80s setting. A new, mysterious, deadly disease whispered about as gay cancer emerged. People burned out in weeks, their bodies covered in sarcomas, turning into living skeletons. Fear was so irrational, so primal, that civilized society instantly regressed. Doctors in America's best clinics feared entering dying patients' rooms. Nurses left trays at doors and fled, holding their breath. Cops donned rubber gloves to arrest protesters. Funeral homes refused bodies, fearing infection from touching a coffin. The Reagan administration pretended the problem didn't exist. The president didn't utter AIDS publicly for years, while thousands of Americans died in isolation, shame, and squalor. Hollywood, that bastion of liberalism, stayed silent. Top stars, even those secretly gay, feared mentioning it would ruin their careers. Supporting AIDS patients equated to confessing unreliability and immorality. And in this plague-ridden silence, Elizabeth Taylor's raspy, smoke-tinged, yet incredibly powerful voice broke through. A personal tragedy was the catalyst. Her close friend, 50s idol, symbol of American masculinity, Rock Hudson, was dying. When Elizabeth visited him, she saw not the handsome giant from Giant, but a wasted old man the world had abandoned. She saw how the system that once adored him now discarded him like a broken toy. For Taylor, this was the trigger. A psychological mechanism, forged through decades of suffering, kicked in, identifying with the outcast. All her life she was judged, called a whore, a homewrecker, a sinner, a fatty. She knew what it felt like to be spat on by the crowd. She knew physical pain that made you want to climb the walls, remember her 70 surgeries. And when she saw these young men dying, abandoned by families, cursed by the church, ignored by the state, she saw not dangerous deviants. She saw brothers in pain. Her own shattered life, her public humiliation, her battles with addiction, all were just preparation, a training ground for this mission. She made a gesture that seems simple today, but was an act of radical, suicidal bravery then. She entered a hospice room. No mask, no gloves. She removed her famous diamonds so they wouldn't get in the way and took a dying patient's hand. She embraced him. The photo of Elizabeth Taylor sitting on a bed holding an AIDS patient's hand was like a nuclear bomb going off. It shattered the wall of fear. It showed the world. Look, I touch him, and I don't die. I embrace him, and I don't get infected. He is a human, not a monster. But she didn't stop at symbolic gestures. She used her bad reputation as a battering ram. She knew the cynical media laws. She knew if she held a dull press conference with doctors, no one would come. But if she, Liz Taylor, great and terrible, wore her finest jewels, attended a gala, and said, "I will speak and you will listen," every camera in the world would be on her. She pulled off a genius social hook. She sold her face, her gossip, her scandalous aura to make the world look at what it turned away from. She founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. She began literally shaking money out of the rich, who feared infection from a handshake. At charity events, she became a racketeer for good. There's a famous story of how at one dinner, she noticed guests reluctant to open their checkbooks. She took the mic, scanned the room with her famous violet eyes, burning with icy fire, and said, "I know how much money you have. I know what you spend it on. And I won't leave this room until you give it to a cause that will save humanity. You think this doesn't concern you? It concerns everyone. And if you don't give, I'll remember every name." Her voice carried the steel of the little girl who once shouted at Louis Mayer. Only now she defended not her mother, but thousands of innocent souls. And they paid. Because refusing Elizabeth Taylor was impossible, she went to the United States Congress. Picture this: Capitol Hill, full of gray-haired conservative men in gray suits who saw AIDS as divine punishment for sodomy. And there sits Elizabeth Taylor. Not as an actress, but as a prosecutor. She tore into them with her eloquence. She shamed them. You do nothing while people die on your country's streets. You call yourselves Christians? Where's your mercy? She forced the political machine, gritting its teeth, to allocate research funding. But the most astonishing thing about this period was Elizabeth's physical state. While saving others, she was slowly dying herself. This is the key moment of our story. We're used to seeing heroes strong and healthy. Superman saves the world because he's invulnerable. Elizabeth saved the world while being a physical wreck. In those years, the 90s and 2000s, she endured excruciating back pain, underwent hip replacements, battled heart failure, survived a brain tumor. Often she arrived at rallies and meetings in a wheelchair, enduring hellish pain. Here lies the supreme irony and grandeur of her fate. A woman considered for half a century the embodiment of selfishness, narcissism, and superficiality, gave the last remnants of her health to fight for strangers. She went further. She began selling her anesthetics. She sold her wedding photos with Larry Fortensky for $1 million. The check went to the fund. She started auctioning her jewelry. The very stones Burton gave her as protection from the world. She converted the memory of her love into medicine for the future. Her logic was simple and deadly. I survived 70 hospitalizations. I survived clinical death. I survived losing the love of my life. Why was I given this life? Why did God pull me back from the brink so many times? Not to make movies, but to do this. She stopped fearing death, the very death that stalked her since Mike Todd's demise. She stared it down in the dying's rooms and realized death wasn't as terrifying as indifference. She found the cure for her eternal loneliness not in another husband, but in serving those lonelier than her. By the end of her life, when her beauty had faded, when she could barely walk, she gained what she never had in her prime: true greatness. Not Hollywood glamour, but human greatness. Journalists who hounded her for decades had to admit defeat. She outplayed them all. She outplayed the celebrity system itself. She proved that scandalous woman, man-eater, temperamental diva, these were just masks hiding a warrior. A wounded, broken, drug-dependent, but utterly unyielding warrior of light. In the end, there's no miraculous healing. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011 from heart failure. Her heart, which loved too much, hurt too often, and held too much of others' grief, simply tired of beating. She was 79, but she didn't leave as a forgotten actress of the past century. She left as a person who changed the course of history. Millions living with HIV today, leading full lives thanks to the medicines she funded, are her greatest role. A role that doesn't earn an Oscar, but grants immortality. She truly lived a life marked by too much pain, too many husbands, too many pills, too many diamonds. But in the end, she left behind too much good, and that's the only too much that matters before eternity. We began this story asking, what is the price of Elizabeth Taylor's life? Now you know the answer. The price is the daily battle with pain that never ceased. Liz Taylor's story isn't a glossy biography. It's a survival guide. It's proof that even if you're broken in childhood, dissected like a frog before the world, even if you make 1,000 mistakes and hit rock bottom, you always have a chance to turn your scars into your superpower. She showed us that being moderate is boring. You must live, love, and fight full throttle, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. If this analysis changed your view of Elizabeth Taylor, and you want to know the truth about other icons whose lives were wrecked by the same system, about Marilyn Monroe, who wasn't a dumb blonde, or Judy Garland, whom Hollywood killed, subscribe to the channel right now, because Liz was just the tip of the iceberg. And remember, reality is always more interesting than the myth. See you next time.